So I got something super cool for you today on Toan, Linux, and more. I'm your host, Adrian, and, well, I'm really pumped to dive into a topic that's going to be super helpful for anyone starting out with Linux. Today, we're talking about the command line interface, which is like, that text-based way of telling your computer what to do.
Hey everyone, I'm Toan, and I'm actually really excited about this episode. The command line is, well, it's basically the heart and soul of Linux, right? It's this incredibly powerful tool that once you get comfortable with it, can make you so much more efficient with your computer.
That's exactly it. And I know a lot of our listeners might be a bit intimidated by all those text commands and stuff. I mean, it looks kind of like hacking in the movies, right?
Yeah, it does have that sort of that matrixy vibe to it, but trust me, it's way more approachable than most people think, and the benefits are massive once you get the hang of the basics. I'm really looking forward to demystifying this for everyone today.
Perfect. So let's get started with breaking down what the command line actually is and why someone would want to use it in 2025 when we have all these fancy graphical interfaces.
So, the command line interface, or CLI as we often call it, it's essentially a text-based way of interacting with your computer. Instead of clicking on icons and navigating through menus, you're typing specific commands that tell the computer exactly what you want it to do. It's like, well, imagine you're having a direct conversation with your computer, but you have to speak its language.
That's interesting. So, it's kind of like texting your computer instead of, using gestures and stuff.
That's actually a great analogy. Yeah, it's like texting specific instructions to your computer, and the computer reads these instructions, these commands, and then executes them precisely as written. No ambiguity, no guessing what you might want, just direct, clear communication.
But I'm curious, with all our modern graphical interfaces that look so sleek and user-friendly, why would anyone still use this text-based approach? Seems kinda old school, right?
That's a fair question. The thing is, well, graphical interfaces are fantastic for many tasks, especially for beginners. They're intuitive and visual, but the command line gives you this incredible power and flexibility that GUIs often can't match.
Power and flexibility? Can you give me an example of what you mean by that?
Absolutely. Let's say you wanted to find all the image files in your computer that are larger than 5 megabytes and were created in the last week, then move them to a new folder. In a GUI, you'd have to navigate through different menus, set up filters, select files, create a folder, and drag them over. It's doable, but tedious.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of clicking around, for sure.
Exactly. But with the command line, you could do all that with a single line of text, one command that precisely describes what you want. And once you've written that command, you can save it, reuse it, modify it, or even schedule it to run automatically. That's the kind of power I'm talking about.
So it's like having a super efficient shortcut for complex tasks?
Precisely. And there's more. Some tasks, especially in system administration, server management, or software development, are either impossible or extremely cumbersome to do with a GUI. For these tasks, the command line isn't just efficient, it's essential.
And I'm guessing that's why Linux users seem so attached to the command line?
You've hit the nail on the head. Linux was built with the command line at its core. It's designed for this kind of interaction, and many of Linux's most powerful features are most accessible through commands. It's why system administrators, developers, and power users across industries still rely heavily on the CLI, even in our graphical interface-dominated world.
So, let's talk about the benefits of using the command line. I mean, beyond just looking like a hacker in movies, what are the actual advantages of typing commands instead of, clicking around?
So I got something super cool for you. The command line isn't just about looking tech-savvy, though that's definitely a fun side effect. The real benefits are, well, they're game-changing once you get comfortable with them.
Like, what kind of benefits specifically?
First off, efficiency. The command line is incredibly fast once you know what you're doing. Things that might take multiple clicks and menu navigations in a GUI can be done with a single short command. Like, remember that example I mentioned about finding files? That's just the tip of the iceberg.
So it's really about speed then?
Speed is a big part, yeah, but it goes beyond that. The command line gives you this precision that's hard to match with graphical interfaces. You can specify exactly what you want done with all sorts of conditions and parameters that might not even be exposed in a GUI.
I've heard people talk about automation with the command line. Is that another big advantage?
Oh, absolutely. That's probably my favorite benefit. See, once you've written a command that works, you can save it as a script and run it whenever you need. You can even schedule these scripts to run automatically at specific times. Imagine having your computer automatically organize your downloads folder, back up your important files, or update your system, all while you're sleeping.
That sounds pretty useful, to be honest.
It's a total game changer. And here's another massive advantage: remote management. With the command line, you can connect to and control servers or computers that are physically located anywhere in the world, as long as they're connected to the internet.
Wait, so you're saying I could control my home computer from, like, a coffee shop across town?
Exactly that, or from another country even. And the connection uses very little bandwidth compared to graphical remote desktop solutions. This is why the command line is absolutely essential for server administration. Most servers don't even have monitors attached to them. They're managed entirely through command line interfaces.
I never thought about that. So for people managing lots of servers,
It's indispensable. And another thing worth mentioning is resource efficiency. Command line tools typically use much less memory and CPU power than their graphical counterparts. This makes them perfect for older hardware, embedded systems, or any situation where resources are limited.
so if I'm trying to breathe new life into an old laptop,
The command line could be your best friend. And finally, there's this incredible ecosystem of tools that work together. In Linux especially, we have this philosophy that each tool should do one thing and do it well. These tools can then be combined in countless ways to solve complex problems. It's like having Lego blocks for computing tasks.
so now that we know the benefits, how do we actually, get to the command line in Linux? What's the first step for someone who's never opened a terminal before?
So, getting to the terminal is actually pretty straightforward in most Linux distributions. The easiest way is usually just to use the system search. Like if you're using Ubuntu or similar distributions, you can just hit the super key, that's the Windows key on most keyboards, and then type terminal, and it'll pop right up.
Oh, that's simple enough. Are there any keyboard shortcuts that people commonly use?
Yeah, absolutely. Most distributions have keyboard shortcuts set up already. The most common one is probably Ctrl plus Alt plus T, which works in Ubuntu, Linux Mint, and quite a few others. It's my go-to, honestly. Saves a lot of time when you're constantly opening terminals like I am.
And what about like different Linux distributions? Do they all handle this the same way?
Well, they're similar but not identical. In distributions with GNOME Desktop, you might find the terminal in the applications menu under Utilities or System Tools. KDE Plasma has it in their application launcher under System. And if you're running something lightweight like XFCE, you can usually right-click on the desktop, and there's an option for Open Terminal here, which is super convenient.
What if someone's using a really minimal setup without a graphical interface at all?
That's a great question. In that case, you're already in what we call a TTY, or text terminal. Linux actually has several of these running simultaneously, and you can switch between them using Ctrl plus Alt plus F1 through F6 typically. If you're in a graphical environment and want to drop to a text-only terminal, those key combinations will take you there. Then Ctrl plus Alt plus F7, or sometimes F1, will bring you back to the graphical environment.
Is the terminal the same across all these different methods of accessing it?
Not exactly. What we're actually talking about are terminal emulators when we're in the graphical environment. The default one might be called GNOME Terminal or Console or XFCE4 Terminal, depending on your desktop environment. They all provide basically the same functionality, but they might have different features, appearances, and settings. The underlying shell, that's the program that actually interprets your commands, is usually the same though, commonly Bash on most Linux systems.
So once I've opened the terminal, I'm ready to start typing commands?
Exactly. Once you see that command prompt, usually ends with a $sign for regular users or a hash symbol for the root user, you're all set to begin exploring the command line world we've been talking about.
Okay, so we've got the terminal open. Uh, Now what? What are the first commands someone should learn to, move around and figure out where they are?
So the first thing you'll want to get comfortable with is basic navigation. Think of your file system like a big tree of folders, right? And you need to be able to move around that tree. There are three essential commands that form the foundation of navigating in the command line: pwd, ls, and cd.
Those sound pretty cryptic to me. What do those letters actually stand for?
Great question. Let's break them down one by one. First, pwd stands for print working directory. It's basically telling you, where am I right now in the file system? When you type pwd and hit enter, it'll show you the complete path of your current location.
Oh, so it's like the "you are here" marker on a mall directory?
That's actually a perfect analogy. Exactly right. And it's super helpful because in the command line, you don't have visual cues like you do in a graphical file manager. So pwd is your compass, telling you exactly where you are.
And what about ls? What does that one do?
ls stands for list. It shows you everything that exists in your current location. It's like opening a folder in a graphical file manager, except instead of seeing icons, you get a text listing of all files and directories. By default, it'll show you the contents of whatever directory you're currently in.
Are there ways to customize what it shows you? Sometimes I only want to see certain types of files, you know?
Absolutely. ls is incredibly flexible. You can add what we call flags or options to modify its behavior. For example, ls-l gives you a long listing with more details like file permissions, size, and modification dates. ls-a shows all files, including hidden ones that start with a dot, and you can combine them like ls-la to get both features at once.
Oh, that's pretty cool. And the last one was CD, right?
Yep, cd means change directory, and it's how you actually move around. So if pwd tells you where you are and ls shows you what's around you, cd is how you travel to a new location. For example, if ls shows a directory called documents, you can type cd documents to move into that folder.
What if I want to go back up a level, like to the parent folder?
Great question. You use cd ... with two dots. The two dots are a special notation that always represents the parent directory. So cd ... will take you up one level. If you want to go up multiple levels quickly, you can use cd ... to go up two levels and so on.
Are there any shortcuts for navigating to common places, like getting to your home folder quickly?
Definitely. Just typing cd by itself, with no arguments, will immediately take you to your home directory from anywhere. You can also use the tilde symbol as a shortcut for your home directory, like cd tilde would do the same thing. And if you want to quickly jump back to the previous directory you were in, cd- will take you there. Super handy when you're working between two locations.
This is all really helpful. So if I understand correctly, I use pwd to check where I am, ls to see what's around me, and cd to move to different places?
Exactly. These three commands are the foundation of moving around in Linux. With just pwd, ls, and cd, you can navigate your entire file system efficiently. Once you get comfortable with these, everything else becomes much easier to learn.
So, now that we can move around the file system, what about actually doing stuff with files? Like creating them, moving them around, that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. File management is where the command line really starts to shine. There are four basic commands that you'll use all the time: touch for creating files, cp for copying, mv for moving or renaming, and rm for removing files.
Let's start with creating files. How does that work?
So the touch command is the simplest way to create an empty file. Let's say you want to create a new text file called notes.txt. You just type touchnotes.txt and boom, you've got a new empty file. It's called touch because it originally was meant to update the timestamp on existing files, but it creates the file if it doesn't exist yet.
That's pretty straightforward. What about copying files from one place to another?
For copying, we use the cp command, which, well, stands for copy. The basic syntax is cp source destination. So if you want to copy that notes.txt file to your documents folder, you'd type something like cp notes.txt documents. If you want to copy an entire directory and everything inside it, you'd add the R flag, which stands for recursive. That'd be cp-r folder name new location.
And if I wanted to move a file instead of copying it?
That's where mv comes in, short for move. The syntax is the same as cp mv source destination. So mv notes.txt documents would move notes.txt to your documents folder. But here's a neat trick. MV is also how you rename files. If both the source and destination are in the same directory, it's effectively a rename operation.
Wait, so if I wanted to rename notes.txt to important underscore notes.txt, I just...
Exactly. You'd type mv notes.txt important notes.txt and you've renamed the file. It's the same command whether you're moving or renaming. The command line doesn't really distinguish between those operations. It's all just changing the path of the file.
That makes sense. Now, what about deleting files? I've heard that can be kind of dangerous in Linux.
You've heard right, and that's a really important point. The delete command in Linux is rm for remove, and unlike deleting files in a graphical environment, there's no trash bin or recycle bin by default. When you rm a file, it's gone, completely gone.
So there's no way to recover it? That sounds pretty scary for beginners.
It can be. This is why there's a saying, Unix gives you enough rope to hang yourself. The basic rm command is rm file name, but you need to be extremely careful, especially when using it with wildcards or the R flag for directories.
Are there any, safety measures people can use to avoid accidentally deleting important stuff?
Absolutely. First, I always recommend using rm with the I flag, which stands for interactive. So rm-a file name will prompt you to confirm before deleting. You can also alias the rm command to always use this flag in your shell configuration.
That sounds helpful. Any other precautions?
Yeah, a few more things. Double check your commands before hitting enter, especially when using wildcards like star that could match more files than you intend. Never run rm-rf or rm-rf star in your root directory. That's basically telling your computer to delete everything. And if you're really nervous, you can use safer alternatives like trash-tli that mimic the behavior of a recycle bin.
That all makes sense. I'm guessing these are commands people use, all the time?
Oh yeah, these 4 commands, touch, cp, mv, and rm, are the bread and butter of file management in Linux. Once you get comfortable with them, you'll find yourself being way more efficient than using a graphical file manager. And the best way to get comfortable is just to practice in a safe environment, maybe in a test directory where you don't have any important files.
So we've covered moving around and managing files, but what about actually looking at what's inside them? How do you view the content of files in the command line?
That's a great question. There are several really useful commands for viewing file contents, and each has its own, special use case. The most basic one is probably cat, short for concatenate, which dumps the entire contents of a file to your terminal.
Cat? Like the animal?
Exactly like the animal, though the name actually comes from its ability to concatenate files together. But most people use it just to display files. So if you have a file called readme.txt, you'd type cat readme.txt, and you'd see the whole file right there in your terminal.
That sounds simple enough. But what if it's a really long file? Wouldn't it just scroll past really quickly?
You've hit on exactly why we need other commands. Cat is great for small files, but for anything longer, it'll just zoom by. That's where the less command comes in. Less is a pager. It shows you one screen of text at a time.
How does that work?
So you type less readme.txt, and it'll display the first screen of the file. You can then use the arrow keys to navigate up and down, or the spacebar to page down. Press Q when you want to quit. It's super handy for large files where you need to read through carefully.
Are there times when you don't want to see the whole file, though?
Absolutely. Sometimes you just need a peek at the beginning or end of a file. That's where head and tail come in. Head shows you the first few lines of a file. By default, it's 10 lines. So head readme txt gives you just the top of the file.
And I'm guessing tail does the opposite.
You got it. Tail shows the last few lines. This is incredibly useful for checking the end of log files, for instance. So tailerror.log would show you the most recent errors.
Is there a way to specify how many lines you want to see?
Yes, both head and tail take a N flag. So if you wanted to see just the first 5 lines, you'd use head-n5 file name. Same with tail-n20 to see the last 20 lines.
What about, one really cool use I've heard about is monitoring files in real time? Like, if new content is being added?
That's one of my favorite features. Tail has this awesome flag, F, which stands for follow. So if you run tail-fserver.log, it'll show you the end of the file and then keep the command running, displaying new lines as they're added to the file. It's super useful for watching log files while you're debugging.
That sounds really powerful. So to sum up, we've got cat for small files, less for reading longer files, head for the beginning, and tail for the end?
Exactly. And they all have their place in your command line toolkit. I use all 4 pretty much daily, depending on what I need to do. They're simple commands, but learning when to use each one will make you much more efficient.
So Toan, I've got to ask, when you're stuck or can't remember a specific command, what do you do? I mean, there's so many commands to learn.
That's actually a really important question, Adrian. The reality is, well, no one memorizes all commands and their options. Even after years of using Linux, I'm constantly looking things up. The good news is that Linux comes with built-in help systems that are incredibly useful.
Really? What kind of help systems?
The most comprehensive one is the man pages. That's short for manual pages. For almost any command, you can type man, followed by the command name. So like, man ls will give you the complete documentation for the ls command.
And what does that show you exactly?
It shows you everything about the command, the name, synopsis, description, all available options, examples, sometimes even the history of the command. Man pages can be pretty detailed, which is both a strength and, sometimes a challenge for beginners because there's so much information.
I can imagine that might be overwhelming at first.
Absolutely. That's why many commands also support the -- help flag, which gives you a more concise overview. So if you type ls -- help, you'll get a shorter summary of the most common options. It's perfect when you just need a quick reminder.
Are there simpler alternatives for complete beginners?
One thing I really like is using the what is command. If you type what is followed by a command name, it gives you a one-line description of what that command does. Sometimes that's all you need to jog your memory.
What about online resources? I'm someone who tends to, Google things a lot.
Oh man, online resources are fantastic these days. Sites like Linux Journey, explainshell.com, and even Stack Overflow are invaluable. I particularly like explainshell because you can paste in a complex command and it'll break down what each part does.
Do you have any other tips for learning commands effectively?
One approach that's worked great for me is to keep a cheat sheet of commands you use frequently. There are tons of these online, but making your own is even better because you'll include the specific commands you actually use.
That makes sense. Customize it to your own workflow.
Exactly. And remember, every expert Linux user was once a beginner. We all still look things up constantly. The goal isn't to memorize everything. It's to know how to find the information you need when you need it.
That's actually really reassuring to hear.
It's the truth. The command line has a bit of a learning curve, but the built-in help systems make it much more approachable than most people think. Just remember, man, help, and your favorite search engine are your best friends when learning Linux.
So, we've covered how to get help, but are there any, shortcuts or tricks that can make command line work faster? You know, those insider tips that pros use?
Oh man, there are so many great ones. This is actually one of my favorite things about the command line. Once you learn a few key shortcuts, you can work incredibly fast. Let's start with what I think is the most essential time saver: tab completion.
Tab completion? What's that?
It's basically magic, Adrian. When you're typing a command or a file path, you can hit the tab key and the shell will try to complete what you're typing. So if I'm trying to change to a directory with a really long name, I might just type the first few letters and hit tab.
And it just fills in the rest for you?
Exactly. If there's only one possible match, it completes it instantly. If there are multiple possibilities, hitting tab twice will show you all the options. This saves so much typing and helps avoid mistakes. I literally can't imagine using the command line without it.
That sounds super useful. Are there other shortcuts like that?
Definitely. Another lifesaver is command history. You can press the up arrow to cycle through commands you've previously entered. So if you need to run a command you just used, or maybe something from a few commands back, just hit the up arrow until you find it.
So you don't have to retype everything. That's handy.
Right. And here's a related tip. You can search your command history by pressing Ctrl+R, then typing part of the command you're looking for. This is perfect when you need to find that complex command you ran last week.
So if I wanted to find that grep command I used yesterday,
You'd press Ctrl+R and type grep, and it would show you the most recent grep command you used. Press Ctrl+R again to cycle through older matches. It's incredibly powerful once you get used to it.
what about keyboard shortcuts for editing commands? Sometimes I make a mistake and have to delete everything.
That's a great question. There are tons of editing shortcuts. Ctrl+A moves to the beginning of the line, Ctrl+E goes to the end. Ctrl+U deletes everything from the cursor to the beginning of the line. Super useful when you want to start over. Ctrl+K deletes from the cursor to the end.
And to delete just a single word?
Ctrl+W deletes the word before the cursor. Once these become muscle memory, you'll be editing commands lightning fast.
Any other time savers you can't live without?
Aliases. You can create shortcuts for commands you use frequently. For example, I have an alias where I just type ll instead of ls.la. You can set these up in your .bashrc or .shrc file depending on your shell.
That sounds, actually really practical for commands with lots of options.
It is. And one last trick. Use the history command to see your recently used commands, each with a number. Then you can run any of them by typing an exclamation point followed by that number. Like exclamation point 42 would run command number 42 from your history.
So Toan, what would you recommend for someone who's just starting out and wants to keep learning about the command line after this episode?
So I got something super cool for you, Adrian, and for our listeners who are just getting started with the command line. The best way to learn is honestly just to use it, Start by tackling small, practical tasks that you'd normally do in the GUI.
Like what kind of tasks?
Well, things like organizing your files, or maybe searching for text in documents. Set yourself little challenges, right? Like, today I'm going to use only the terminal to download a file and extract its contents. These practical exercises will make the commands stick way better than just memorizing them.
That makes sense. Are there any specific resources you'd recommend for people to check out?
Absolutely. There's this fantastic website called linuxcommand.org that has a really structured approach to learning. The Bash Guide for Beginners from the Linux Documentation Project is another excellent resource. It's comprehensive but still approachable for newcomers.
Are there any interactive ways to learn? Sometimes reading documentation can be a bit dry.
Oh yeah, there are some great interactive options. Linux Journey is an amazing free online resource with interactive exercises. And there's this cool site called overthewire.org that has command line games, particularly one called Bandit that teaches you commands through progressive challenges. It's like learning through gameplay, which makes it super engaging.
What about books? Any recommendations there?
The Linux Command Line by William Schatz is my go-to recommendation. It's clear, thorough, and written with beginners in mind. I actually still reference it sometimes. And for something a bit more advanced when you're ready, Bash Cookbook has tons of practical recipes for common tasks.
And do you think it's worth setting up a a virtual machine to practice?
That's a fantastic suggestion. Setting up a virtual machine with a Linux distribution like Ubuntu or Linux Mint gives you a sandbox to experiment in. The great thing is you can break things without consequences. Just reset the VM and you're good to go. It's perfect for trying those more adventurous commands that you might be nervous about running on your main system.
Any final advice for beginners?
My biggest piece of advice is don't get discouraged. Everyone, and I mean everyone, makes mistakes when learning the command line. When I started out, I definitely deleted things I shouldn't have and had to learn the hard way. The key is to be patient with yourself and celebrate the small wins. And remember, your terminal history is your friend. Review commands you've used to reinforce what you've learned.
So, Toan, we've covered a lot of ground today. Maybe we should kind of wrap things up with the main points for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So we started with what the command line interface actually is. This text-based way of controlling your computer that's been around forever, but is still incredibly powerful, right? And we talked about why it's still super relevant today, especially for Linux users.
And then we went through, the benefits of using it over graphical interfaces. I was surprised by how much more efficient it can be.
That's the thing that gets people hooked. Once you see how quickly you can get things done, especially repetitive tasks, it's hard to go back. We covered the basic navigation commands like cd, ls, and pwd that help you move around the file system. And then the essential file management stuff like creating, copying, and deleting files.
Don't forget the viewing commands. Cat, less, head, tail. There are so many ways to look at file content.
And those help commands are absolute lifesavers when you're starting out. The man pages, the -- help flags, I still use those all the time, you know? And then those tips and tricks we discussed, tab completion, command history, keyboard shortcuts, those will save you hours once you get comfortable with them.
Thanks so much for sharing all your knowledge today, Toan. I feel like our listeners now have a really solid foundation to start exploring the command line in Linux.
It was my pleasure. I'm passionate about this stuff, and I hope listeners feel inspired to open up that terminal and start experimenting. The command line might seem intimidating at first, but trust me, once you get comfortable with it, you'll wonder how you ever lived without it.
And that's it for this episode of Toan Does Linux and More. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. We've got plenty more Linux topics coming up that we're excited to share with you.
And remember, the best way to learn is by doing. So open that terminal and start typing. We'll catch you in the next episode.
Take care, everyone.